Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Flying with Spurts. This is just going to be a quick interlude with the Harrier. I did have a request to do a flight model review. Those take a bit of time, both in getting the flying set up and doing the data analysis. But one thing I wanted to talk about before going into the flight model review is some of the things to keep in mind when flying the Harrier. The first and easiest to cover is the flaps. The flaps handle. You set it to cruise, locks the flaps at 5 degrees. See what that looks like on the outside? Hang on, let me actually kind of get myself trimmed up a bit here. There we go. So here's cruise flaps. It says 5 degrees, but it looks like they're not deflected at all. Maybe it's taking into account the angle of incidence. When you go to auto, see it drop the flaps down a bit. Now they're at 6 degrees. Alright, we should be slow enough. Pull back a little more power. Then there's stall flaps. 25 degrees. Back to auto. Down to stall. Now, what is the point of this little visual demonstration? I'm glad you asked. Give it a little more gas here for maneuvering. See, when the flaps are in auto, they will automatically adjust based on speed and angle of attack. Very similar to, say, the Tomcats in auto. And I'm going to reference the Tomcats here just because. You'll see why in a bit. And also, much like the Tomcat, auto flaps have a maximum limit. It won't go over 25 no matter what I do. Now, if I put the flaps in stall, they start at 25. They do not respond to angle of attack. They're kind of fixed. Now, when you actually engage in a short takeoff or a vertical landing, those can go down as far as 60. I've not messed around with them enough to know if that's automatic based on the landing gear being out, the forward airspeed being too low, or the vectoring of the nozzles. I suppose I can test the vectoring of the nozzles quickly enough. Let's get airspeed down below 200. Oop, there we go. Okay, so it seems like once nozzles get to 50, they're at full. and it very much changes the flaps based on nozzle setting. Going back to 25 by about 20 degrees, 22 degrees nozzle. Oh, there, that didn't take long, did it? So, for the purposes of the flight model test, I will be leaving the flaps in auto. I will also not be using thrust vectoring. I will not be deflecting the nozzles for my tests. Now, if deflecting the nozzles is not the shorter thing that I needed to talk about, or the longer of the things that I needed to talk about, because, well, frankly, it's very short to say I'm not going to do it, then what is the thing that I needed to talk about? Engine setting. The Pegasus is a very, very different engine from the other engines in DCS. The other engines, you can basically just ramp it up to mill power or afterburner power and just ignore it. And the exception of some things like the MiG-21, where if you overspeed the engine, it'll flame out. You know, something like the Tomcat or the F-16, the Hornet, you don't need to worry about it. The Pegasus will cook itself. So it has limitations and rules. We have the highest performing model of the Pegasus engine in this Harrier. But even still, there's some things to keep in mind. 102% RPM is maximum continuous power. You can do this indefinitely. That is not full play on the throttle. If I advance the throttle all the way, it goes up to 109. You can do this for about 15 minutes. Now this is perfect for climb out, because as you climb in altitude, the engine will no longer be able to reach 109% RPM. So it self-corrects. At least it did the last time I tried it. It's been a while. Then there's the magic button. Combat thrust. The button in the cockpit is located just under the water nozzle. What that does is it increases the maximum from 109 to 111. That 111 has to be maintained manually, which means you can reach 111 at higher altitudes than what we're at now. That setting is only good for 10 minutes. Bring up the old engine page. There we go. Now we see it starting to decrease. So now even with combat thrust, I cannot reach 111% RPM up at 19,000 feet. For the purposes of the test, I will use combat thrust. Reason being is I will have notionally 5 minutes of fuel. My 5 minutes. For the FM testing I did for the Tomcat, Hornet, and Viper, That is what they had available. They set their fuel loads to equal a notional 5 minutes of sea level static uninstalled thrust, based off Wikipedia thrust ratings and for specific fuel consumption values. So what does that mean for the Harrier's fuel? Well, you may have already seen what my fuel load is right now. You may not have. Pegasus is a fairly high bypass turbofan with no afterburner, which means instead of having 5 minutes of afterburning fuel, I have effectively 5 minutes of mill power fuel. And I base the thrust value on adjusting for the combat thrust rating, not the maximum wet lift short thrust rating, which gives me very little fuel. And even with the gun pod added, oh, I hit the wrong button. That's embarrassing. I thought I hit the button for combat thrust, but instead I hit the button for dropping my landing gear. How terribly embarrassing. The joys of VR. There we go. See, now we see that the RPM is a fixed limit at 111. Anyway, where was I? Ah, yes, fuel load. So even with the gun pods installed, a fuel load of 1,300 pounds and no water means that I weigh a whopping 16,000 pounds and change? 17,000 and change? $18,491. Although that might be related to a bug with H2O load being counted even when it's empty, which should be fixed in the next patch. Now, at combat thrust, I have ballpark 21,000 pounds of thrust available. My thrust to weight ratio is going to be bonkers. Now, this does not mean I will have a crazy high top speed or even top end accelerations of the other jets.
Landing gear. Landing gear. Landing gear.
Landing gear, landing gear. Be quiet. Speaking of which, let me turn these off just because I don't like them. Off. Off. Because of the inlet design, I start losing thrust almost as soon as I start moving forward. Now, it's not drastic, but I cannot get fast enough to really get that ram air pressure recovery effect, and my inlet's not designed for it. This is the inlet is really what keeps the Harrier subsonic. Now, one of the things about cooking the Harrier engine, let me put the HUD into stall mode so it's easier to see. So we can see,
Landing gear.
right, maybe I'll put out the landing gear just to shut that thing up. We can see my RPM, the next to R, and my jet exhaust temperature next to J. See that my nozzles are at 82 degrees and my flaps are at 62 degrees. Now, according to the engine page, I've already cooked my engines a bit. Which is going to be a problem. But this will actually be a great way to demonstrate why. Now, according to this, I should be able to have a dry vertical takeoff at 2,000 pounds of fuel. I have 1,300 pounds of fuel. So as I slow down, you can see that my RPM is already approaching maximum to where it's going to start doing damage again. Oh, there it goes. So did you see how it closed the septagon? Sextagon? Sextagon. It closed that little six-sided figure around R, and it grew a little tail. When that happens, that means that I'm in the time-limited thrust window. Let me get my nose up, I'm drifting forward. We see that I'm within that combat thrust RPM right now. I could theoretically maintain this hover for 10 minutes before doing further damage to the engine. This is not my maximum applicable power. But going to maximum power isn't giving me much right now. So my RPMs are up at max. Jet pipe temperatures are not going over temperature. You can see they're not even appreciably climbing. I'm climbing a little bit. See my compressor RPMs, 98%.
Caution.
Getting my 15-second caution warnings. Jet pipe temperature has gone up. There we go. Now my thrust is bleeding off.
15 seconds.
And I'm at full power still.
15 seconds.
And I'm going to crash.
15 seconds.
That's okay, because I'm going to reload and show you what the performance would look like if you don't cook the engines. And for some reason, this is starting with a cooked engine. Well, that's aggravating. So anyway, those are going to be some things to keep in mind when I'm doing my Harrier testing and for future Harrier videos.
Altitude.
Ugh, I need to turn you off again?
Altitude.
Sure, I start with a cooked engine, but the altitude warning resets every time. So I look forward to being able to run these tests and present my analysis soon. Hope you all enjoy watching it as much as I'm going to enjoy making it. See you next time.